Welcome again to Earlswood Baptist Church House Group. This week we're starting a new series, looking at Mark's Gospel. Maybe we'll get through it all, maybe we'll take a break in a few weeks' time, but we'll start and see where we get to. What we're doing is going to be based on some Bible studies by the late Michael Spencer, who was an interesting character, quite ecumenical after a strict Baptist and Reformed upbringing in early years, died young, but quite a prophetic voice too. Always interesting to listen to and very challenging. But as you read Michael Spencer's blogs and Bible studies, fundamentally it comes down to one thing. Our faith is all about Jesus, and I hope that's what's going to come out as we look at the Gospel. This week's just an introduction, one verse, but a chance to look at the book itself and how we got it and where it comes from. Then why study Mark? Well, it's probably the first Gospel. When we look through the rest of the New Testament, Matthew uses almost every verse of Mark verbatim. Luke uses more than half of Mark. And interestingly, when you look at John's Gospel, John, despite being so different from the other three in its form, actually echoes Mark in a number of places. So a number of academics have thought that probably John had actually seen Mark before writing his own Gospel and used bits and pieces from it. The other Gospel writers obviously felt that Mark was dependable, and historically only Paul's letters predate Mark. So we find that Mark is the closest in time we can get to Jesus himself. Jesus was crucified in the early 30s, and Mark probably wrote in the 60s. So as we read Mark, this is perhaps the closest we can get to standing and hearing the voice of Jesus himself. It's quite raw in its writing, Mark. It's not very polished like some of the other Gospels in its Greek. It's just a summary of what Jesus said. We get close to him as we read it. And it's very focused too. Mark always focuses on the cross. All through the Gospel, we have echoes of what's going to happen to Jesus. And the final reason for looking at it is simply that it's the shortest Gospel. We might even get through it. And I might just add one more reason for looking at the Gospel. Our faith is centred on Jesus. However important the rest of the Scriptures are, from Genesis to Revelation, we can get tied up in studying Paul's letters and the theology and this and that and the other. They're very important. But when we come to tough times, like a pandemic to live through, we need to keep returning to Jesus and remember that he is truly the way, the truth and the life, and we're following him. Mark's Gospel is authors and origins. The Church Fathers gave evidence that the Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark, who was a companion of the Apostle Peter in Rome at the end of Peter's life. This is almost certainly the same John Mark who also appears in Acts and appears with Paul in Colossians, Timothy and Philemon. John Mark said to have written down the remembrances of Peter that he thought in his preaching, and as well as the other sayings of Jesus. And this gives us a likely date for the letter, as Peter is traditionally thought to have been martyred by Nero around AD 64 to 67. And all this, of course, is before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The Church Father Papias writes, as reported by Eusebius a couple of centuries later, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately everything that he'd remembered, without, however, recording the order which was said and done by Christ. For neither did he hear the Lord, nor did he follow him, but afterwards, as I said, attended Peter, who adapted his instructions to the needs of his hearers, but had no design of giving a connected account of the Lord's oracles. So then Mark made no mistake, while he thus wrote down some things as he remembered them, for he made it his one care not to omit anything that he heard, or to set down any false statement therein. So Mark's Gospel is a summary of Peter's sermons, as Peter, having lived with Jesus for 3 years, teaches the church in Rome. We find that Mark starts with John the Baptist, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and ends with the cross and the resurrection. But in between, things are not chronological, they're more thematic. And Mark is remembering what Peter preached, rather than having an accurate biography sort of year by year of what Jesus did. We come to the scriptures at last, Mark 1:1. It's such a short reading, I've given David Suchet the week off this week. It says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And this raises a few questions for us. What is a gospel? Well, the word fundamentally says it all. The gospel is good news. And when we read it, we expect to hear good news in a world that's full of bad news. But we also find that the 4 Gospels also have much in common with the Greek biographies. They are a reliable but edited record of a life. And if we think of the biographies that are written today, we can see why 4 Gospels is entirely reasonable, because there are many biographies, say, of Winston Churchill, and they all come at the subject with a different angle and have slightly different episodes recorded in it. So it's not unreasonable to think of the Gospels as a biography of Jesus, and there are certainly things in common with the way the Greeks wrote. And that does, of course, remind us that the Gospels don't contain everything about Jesus, as John's Gospel tells us at the end, but they are enough to give an accurate picture of his life. They obviously contain some of his words verbatim. They contain and accurate summaries of what he taught, and they enable us to choose to follow him and live a Christian life. So why did Mark write? He wants that good news to get out to the people around him, to a world who didn't know him. And we have exactly the same challenge today. Different people take Jesus in a different way. To Islam, he's a prophet. Buddhism, another enlightened one. To Judaism, he's a good man, but he's obviously a false Messiah. To Hinduism, he's just another avatar, another expression of God. And to many, he's just a good man, an inspired teacher. But you dare mention anything about God and divinity, and you're in trouble. So everyone owns him, but very few know him. And Mark's Gospel writes to try and correct those wrong views. And Mark is quick to set down Jesus' identity. He's Messiah. Messiah, or Christ in Greek, means anointed one. And of course we all know that the Jews at that time were looking for a Messiah who was rather different. They wanted one who was belligerent, who would free them from the Roman rule. There are many Messiahs. A lot of them ended up on crosses. But Mark says that Jesus is the real one, even though he's completely different from the military leader that the Jews were looking for. And there's also the expression in this verse as Son of God. It's slightly ambiguous. I think Jesus used it as he taught, so that people wouldn't immediately accuse him of blasphemy, because Son of God could just be applied to any human being, that we're all sons and daughters of God. But yet there's a pointedness to this, that there's more than a description of just any old man. There's a hint that Jesus really was God's Son. There was a divinity about him. And it begins to, or even at this early time, bring in the concept of 3 gods in one God of Trinity. And for us, this Tuesday? A couple of questions we can think about. What is your favourite gospel? Indeed, what are your favourite Bible books? I'd be interested to hear that. And if you think about that, does your choice say something about you and your character? Maybe looking at that, maybe direct you to read some other bits of the Bible. And I think the challenge we have at the moment is, how do we pass on the good news of the gospel in the middle of a pandemic? We're all very aware that we're not very good at this at the best of times. What can we do now to preach the gospel, to share Jesus with those around us? I think that's going to be important for us as a church to consider in the weeks and months ahead.